There comes a point in life where you start noticing things that once blended into the background, the inconsistencies in people's words, the hidden intentions behind their smiles, the unspoken tension in a room, the patterns that repeat even when everyone swears it's just coincidence. And the moment you begin seeing what others don't, you are no longer the same person. You can't go back to pretending. You can't unsee the truth. Some think having deeper vision is a blessing, but the truth is at first, it feels like a curse. Because when you see differently, you no longer fit comfortably into the world that demands sameness. You start asking questions others avoid. You start noticing behavior people try to hide. You see red flags they call misunderstandings. You recognize manipulation they call love. And you detect deceit in situations the world insists are sincere. And suddenly, you are the one who seems too sensitive, too analytical, or too intense. Not because you're wrong, but because you're right before anyone else realizes it. The danger of seeing what others don't is simple. People often fear the person who sees too clearly. They fear you because you notice cracks in their masks. They fear you because your intuition exposes what they try to bury. They fear you because your clarity makes their denial uncomfortable. Vision disrupte illusion. Awareness challenges the roles people are acting out, and truth has a way of making those who hide feel threatened. You'll find that some distance themselves from you, not because you did something wrong, but because your presence makes it harder for them to pretend. But here is a deeper reality. Seeing what others don't is not just perception, it is responsibility. You have to carry the weight of understanding. You have to manage the loneliness that clarity brings. You have to watch people walk into mistakes you foresaw because they weren't ready to listen. And perhaps the hardest part is this. You must learn to speak carefully. Not every truth can be shared. Not every person is ready to hear what you understand. Your insight can heal, but it can also disrupt. So wisdom becomes the bridge between what you know and what the world is ready to accept. The danger isn't just that others won't understand you. The real danger is that you begin doubting yourself. You start asking, why do I see this when no one else does? You try to dim your awareness just to fit in. You question your intuition to avoid conflict. You silence your inner voice so others feel comfortable. But hear this clearly. Your insight is not dysfunction. Your intuition is not overthinking. Your perception is not paranoia. It is your inner awakening, recognizing truths long before the collective catches up. Yes, seeing what others don't will isolate you. Yes, it will make you feel misunderstood. But it will also give you power. The power to protect yourself, to understand life at its deeper layers, to rise above superficiality, and to navigate the world with eyes wide open. The world has always been shaped by those who saw beyond the surface, not by those who merely followed the crowd. Clarity will push you into solitude, but solitude will push you into strength. Awareness will push you into discomfort, but discomfort will evolve you into wisdom. Perception as a burden is one of the most misunderstood psychological experiences a person can go through, because society often praises clarity, insight, and intuition without acknowledging the weight they place on the mind that carries them. People assume that seeing deeply is always a strength, always an advantage, always a sign of wisdom. But they don't recognize that perception, when heightened, can feel like an emotional load that others never have to bear. It is not merely about understanding the world. It is about sensing what lies beneath it. The things people don't say, the tension they don't admit, the motives they hide behind politeness, the contradictions they weave into everyday interactions. And once you begin seeing these patterns, you can't turn them off. Your mind becomes a constant observer, always analyzing, always absorbing, always decoding layers that most people ignore without effort. Perception becomes a burden when you notice the small cracks in relationships long before they break, yet you can't explain them to people who insist everything is fine. You feel the emotional shifts in a conversation before anyone else acknowledges them. You sense dishonesty not because someone lies outright, but because something in their tone, their eyes, their energy doesn't match their words. Others glide through life trusting what they see. You walk through life questioning it, And while this depth can protect you, it often isolates you too. Because how do you explain what you perceive when the world around you prefers simple explanations and comfortable illusions? It's exhausting to carry awareness that others don't share. You may see the red flags in someone that your friends praise. You may understand the hidden dynamics in a workplace that everyone else calls normal. You may recognize manipulation disguised as affection or insecurity disguised as confidence. And when you speak up, people may label you as overthinking, negative, or paranoid. They aren't doing this because you're wrong. They're doing it because your truth disrupts their comfort. Most people choose blindness because seeing clearly requires courage, and courage is a requirement not everyone is willing to meet. There are moments when your perception feels like a curse because it distances you from the innocence you once had. You no longer take words at face value. You no longer accept people at the level they present themselves. You no longer fit into the simplicity you once lived in. You're constantly aware of the undercurrent beneath things, and that awareness can drain you. It's not that you want to see more, it's that you can't help but see more. And sometimes you wish you could go back to not realizing so much. But perception does not come with an off switch. And once awakened, the mind refuses to return to the fog where it once felt safe. Perception can also place you in situations where you have to carry knowledge alone. You might observe someone's self-destruction long before they reach the point of collapse, yet you can't force them to see what they don't want to. You might detect a slow erosion of intimacy in a relationship while the other person insists everything is fine. You might see the true nature of someone's intentions while everyone else believes the facade. And in these moments, the burden is not only what you see, it is the responsibility of knowing when to speak, when to stay silent, and when to walk away. Wisdom forces you to balance truth with timing, and not everyone understands the weight of that choice. The burden grows heavier when your perception extends inward, when you see your own weaknesses with painful clarity. While others can hide from themselves, you cannot. You recognize your patterns, your wounds, your missteps. You face the parts of yourself you would rather ignore because your mind refuses to let them pass unnoticed. And this self-awareness, while transformative, is also demanding. It asks you to grow when you want to stay the same. It asks you to heal when you want to hide. It asks you to move forward even when comfort tempts you backward. Perception becomes a mirror that shows reflections you cannot avoid, and that makes growth an obligation rather than a choice. Yet perhaps the greatest burden of perception is the loneliness it brings. When you see differently, you live differently. Your connections change, your expectations shift, your tolerance for superficiality fades. You begin to crave authenticity, depth, and honesty, because anything else feels hollow. But not everyone can meet you at that level. And so you learn to walk alone, not because you want to, but because the path you walk requires eyes that not everyone possesses. Awakening creates tension in ways that are subtle, pervasive, and often misunderstood by those who have not yet experienced it. It is not a loud or sudden event that everyone recognizes. It begins quietly, like a shift in the air before a storm, an awareness that something beneath the surface is changing. You begin noticing patterns in the world that were once invisible, connections between events and behaviors that others ignore, and the hidden motivations behind people's actions that everyone else accepts at face value. Awakening is the slow uncovering of layers, both in the world and within yourself. And it brings with it attention that is impossible to escape because your consciousness has moved to a higher frequency, one that resists old illusions and comfortable lies. It is attention born from clarity, and clarity is always uncomfortable to the unprepared. One of the first ways this tension manifests is in relationships. As you awaken, you begin to perceive not only the surface behavior of people around you, but the deeper intentions that drive them. You notice duplicity where others see honesty, manipulation where others see affection, and avoidance where others see peace. This awareness isolates you, not because you wish to be alone, but because others are often threatened by your insight. They sense that you see through their facades, and the subtle tension between their comfort and your clarity begins to create friction. You may find conversations harder to maintain, casual interactions more exhausting, and connections that once felt effortless now fraught with unspoken strain. Awakening demands discernment, and discernment is not always received kindly. The tension extends beyond interpersonal relationships into every aspect of life. Once awakened, you cannot ignore the realities of injustice, hypocrisy, and imbalance that are omnipresent in society. You begin to see systemic flaws, patterns of corruption, and repetitive cycles of human error that others accept as normal. This creates an internal conflict between the desire to remain at peace and the urge to confront the truth. It is not an easy balance to maintain. The world continues to operate on assumptions, distractions, and half-truths, while your mind and heart recognize realities that cannot be dismissed. The tension becomes constant because every decision, every action, and every observation is filtered through a lens of deeper understanding. Life no longer feels neutral. It feels charged with responsibility. Awakening also creates tension within the self. As you shed illusions, you begin to confront parts of yourself that were previously hidden or denied. Your fears, insecurities, and patterns of avoidance come into focus. You recognize the ways in which you have been complicit in your own suffering or in the suffering of others, and the weight of that recognition can be profound. Inner dialogue intensifies because every choice and emotion is now examined with greater scrutiny. Comfort zones shrink, habits lose their appeal, and familiar routines begin to feel hollow. This tension is a necessary catalyst for growth, but it can be deeply uncomfortable. You may feel restless, irritable, or impatient with yourself and the world because awakening does not allow you to settle for mediocrity or distraction. It demands movement, evolution, and awareness, and that process is inherently stressful. The tension of awakening is amplified by the disconnect between your perception and that of the collective. You begin to see truths that others resist or deny, and this creates friction in every sphere where your understanding exceeds the norm. People may interpret your awareness as judgment, criticism, or disapproval, even when it is simply observation. Social, professional, and familial interactions are complicated because your mindset has shifted, but the world around you has not. You may feel frustrated by their inability to see what is obvious to you, and they may feel unsettled by your unwillingness to accept their perspectives unquestioningly. This mutual discomfort produces a tension that is often subtle but relentless, a quiet undercurrent that shapes every interaction. Spiritual and psychological tension also emerges as part of awakening. As you recognize the patterns that govern human behavior, the illusions that dominate social structures, and the limitations of conventional thinking, your worldview begins to transform. You are confronted with questions about purpose, authenticity, and truth that have no simple answers. Certainties you once relied upon now seem inadequate, and the process of integrating deeper understanding into daily life is a challenge. You feel pulled between action and observation, between participation in the world and detachment from it, between accepting imperfection and demanding integrity. Each day presents choices that are more complex, decisions that carry greater weight, and awareness that can be simultaneously illuminating and burdensome. Awakening creates tension because it forces you to live in a state of contradiction. You are aware of the illusions around you, yet you must navigate them gracefully. You see the patterns others ignore, yet you cannot simply impose your understanding on them. You recognize your own limitations even as you strive toward greater insight, and every interaction, every thought, every feeling is filtered through this heightened consciousness. The tension is not a flaw. It is a byproduct of evolution, a signal that your perception and understanding have expanded beyond the ordinary. Yet that expansion is neither gentle nor easy, because awareness always demands adaptation, responsibility, and resilience. Inner vision demands courage in ways that are often invisible to the outside world. It is not the kind of courage celebrated in stories of heroism or daring feats. It is quieter, more persistent, and far more taxing. It is the courage to look within oneself and face truths that have long been ignored, hidden, or denied. It is the courage to recognize one's own flaws, biases, and vulnerabilities without flinching. Inner vision requires the ability to see the shadow aspects of your character, the unhealed wounds that shape behavior, and the patterns that repeat across time and relationships. Most people avoid this work because it is uncomfortable, and it demands a form of bravery that is often invisible yet transformative. To cultivate inner vision is to willingly confront uncertainty. It is to acknowledge that the mind is not a neutral observer, but a collection of narratives, assumptions, and emotional attachments that have guided behavior for years. To see clearly, you must question these internal structures and challenge the stories you have told yourself about who you are, what you deserve, and how the world operates. This process can be destabilizing because it undermines the comfort of familiar identity. To know oneself fully, to see the unfiltered truth of your desires, fears, and motivations, is to step into a space of vulnerability that demands courage. Many resist this because they fear what they might discover. Inner vision also requires the courage to witness the world without illusions. Once you have developed clarity about yourself, it becomes impossible to ignore the dynamics around you that others accept unquestioningly. You begin to notice hypocrisy, deceit, and the subtle mechanisms of control in personal, social, and institutional structures. You see how influence, manipulation, and fear shape behavior, and you recognize the fragility of the facades people maintain. Living with this awareness demands courage because it isolates you in subtle ways. Relationships shift, assumptions about trust are challenged, and interactions with the world carry a new weight. Courage is necessary to remain steady amid the unease of seeing what others do not. Moreover, inner vision demands courage because it requires action informed by insight. Understanding patterns and truths is not enough. The next step is to integrate this knowledge into choices and behavior. This often means making difficult decisions that may disappoint others, challenge social norms, or confront deeply ingrained habits. Acting in alignment with what is truly understood, rather than what is convenient or comfortable, is an act of bravery that the external world rarely acknowledges. The stakes are personal, emotional, and sometimes existential, because you are choosing authenticity over complacency, awareness over ignorance, and responsibility over ease. Courage in inner vision also entails the patience to navigate slow growth. Awareness is not an event, it is a process, and the insights it brings often arrive gradually, in fragments, and sometimes painfully. There is a tension between the knowledge you acquire and the time it takes to embody it fully. You see possibilities and potential outcomes long before others do, yet you must wait, observe, and exercise restraint. This patience requires courage, because it is easier to act impulsively, to force understanding, or to impose insights prematurely. Inner vision challenges you to hold yourself accountable, to live ethically and intentionally even when the results are delayed or unseen, and to withstand the discomfort of knowing more than you can immediately act upon. Another aspect of courage demanded by inner vision is the willingness to experience emotional intensity without avoidance. Clarity brings with it a profound sensitivity to life, its beauty, its pain, and its contradictions. You perceive subtle emotions in others, sense the underlying tensions in interactions, and recognize the consequences of actions before they unfold. This heightened perception can be overwhelming if not met with steady courage. It requires a balance of empathy and discernment, compassion and boundaries, observation and engagement. To live fully in awareness is to feel deeply, and deep feeling requires courage because it opens you to vulnerability, loss, and the unpredictability of existence. Inner vision also calls for the courage to challenge collective illusions. Societal norms, shared beliefs, and cultural narratives shape perception in ways that are often unquestioned. Those with heightened insight may see the flaws, contradictions, or manipulations embedded in these structures. Speaking, acting, or living in alignment with these observations can provoke resistance, misunderstanding, or isolation. Courage is required to navigate the tension between inner truth and external expectation, to maintain integrity without aggression, and to foster understanding while avoiding futile conflict. It is a delicate balance that requires strength of character, clarity of purpose, and trust in one's own judgment. Finally, inner vision demands courage because it is a continuous journey rather than a destination. Clarity does not arrive fully formed, and insight must be tested, refined, and integrated throughout life. Each new awareness brings new challenges, new responsibilities, and new opportunities for growth. The mind and heart must remain vigilant, open, and resilient. The courage required is not a single act, but a sustained commitment to face life with honesty, to navigate uncertainty with confidence, and to embrace the transformative power of seeing oneself and the world as they truly are. Misunderstanding is inevitable when a person begins to perceive the world differently, when awareness deepens, and when the inner landscape of thought and emotion becomes more nuanced. It is not a flaw, nor a failure, but a natural consequence of seeing beyond what is immediately visible, of thinking beyond what is comfortably accepted, and of feeling more acutely than those around you. Human communication is inherently limited. Words are symbols that only approximate the complexity of thought, and gestures, expressions, and intentions are filtered through individual perception. When your understanding of reality expands, the risk of being misunderstood grows, because the depth you perceive cannot always be conveyed in language, and the layers of meaning you notice may be invisible to those who have not cultivated the same awareness. From the earliest stages of insight, misunderstanding becomes apparent in relationships. When you begin recognizing hidden motives, subtle deceptions, or unspoken truths, others may interpret your observations as criticism, suspicion, or cynicism. They may see your clarity as hostility, your caution as distrust, or your questions as doubt. This is not because your perceptions are incorrect, but because awareness often disrupts comfort. People tend to interpret reality in ways that align with their own desires, fears, and assumptions. When someone operates from a different awareness than you, your observations challenge their narrative, and their instinct is often to defend the illusion rather than confront the truth. This natural friction produces misunderstanding, tension, and sometimes even conflict. Misunderstanding is particularly pronounced when your inner life is richer than what can be expressed outwardly. Thoughts, intuitions, and emotional subtleties are not always communicable. You may perceive layers of meaning in a situation, sensing the implications of actions and words before others even notice them. You may feel patterns repeating in relationships, detect the early signs of harm or betrayal, or intuit the unspoken needs and fears of those around you. Yet when you attempt to articulate these perceptions, the listener may hear only fragments or interpret your words through their own lens. They may mistake caution for fear, discernment for doubt, or insight for suspicion. The greater the depth of understanding, the more likely your communication will be filtered through their limitations, creating misunderstanding by default. Misunderstanding is also inevitable in professional and social contexts. When your vision extends beyond the ordinary, when you notice systemic patterns, contradictions, or inefficiencies, your observations may be dismissed, ignored, or mischaracterized. Colleagues, friends, and family often operate within accepted norms, and deviations from these norms can trigger defensiveness. Your perspective may appear threatening, your caution may be interpreted as criticism, and your recommendations may be resisted not because they lack merit, but because they challenge established comfort. In such moments, misunderstanding is unavoidable because your awareness is not aligned with the collective perception. The tension between insight and conformity is a natural consequence of seeing more than the average observer. Even self-expression can be misunderstood. The process of translating internal clarity into external action is fraught with risk. Words and behaviors can never fully convey the intricacies of your thought processes or the intensity of your perception. People may project their insecurities, assumptions, and expectations onto you, interpreting your intentions in ways you never intended. Your patience may be read as indifference, your caution as indecision, or your reflection as avoidance. Misunderstanding arises because the internal and external worlds are not perfectly synchronized, and human interpretation is always subjective. No matter how careful, honest, or precise you are, there will always be gaps between perception and reception. Cultural and contextual differences further magnify misunderstanding. People are shaped by different experiences, beliefs, and worldviews. What seems obvious to you may be invisible or even nonsensical to someone else. Your insights, born from observation and introspection, may collide with collective assumptions, social norms, or ingrained habits. In such cases, even the most sincere efforts at communication can be misread, dismissed, or distorted. Misunderstanding is inevitable because perception is relative and clarity in one mind is not universally shared. Emotional resonance also plays a role. When you see more, you feel more. You experience empathy, awareness, and emotional subtleties that others may not recognize or understand. Your response to a situation may be influenced by layers of perception that are invisible to those around you. In their view, your reactions may seem exaggerated, overly cautious, or unnecessary. They may misinterpret the depth of your concern or the motivations behind your actions. Misunderstanding arises because emotional insight is difficult to communicate, and those without the same sensitivity interpret actions through their own framework, often inaccurately. Ultimately, misunderstanding is a natural byproduct of awareness. It is the friction that exists whenever clarity exceeds collective comprehension. It arises from differences in perception, communication limitations, emotional resonance, and the complexity of human intention. Those who see deeply must accept that their truth will not always be recognized, that their insight will sometimes be questioned, and that their motivations will occasionally be misinterpreted. Misunderstanding is not a reflection of failure, but a reflection of the gap between insight and perception, between awareness and collective acceptance. Clarity is a responsibility, not a privilege, because to see clearly is not simply to possess knowledge or insight. It is to bear the weight of understanding in a world that often resists truth. Awareness is not neutral. It carries implications, consequences, and obligations that extend far beyond the self. When you gain clarity, you are no longer free to ignore the dynamics at play around you. You cannot pretend that deception, manipulation, or injustice do not exist because your perception has revealed them. This awareness brings with it a duty to act wisely, to navigate life with integrity, and to balance insight with empathy. Clarity is therefore not a luxury. It is a call to responsibility, a burden that demands careful attention and deliberate action. The responsibility of clarity first manifests within the self. When you see clearly, you are confronted with the truths of your own mind and behavior. You must acknowledge the ways in which you have been blind, the patterns you have unconsciously repeated, and the shadows that influence your choices. It is easy to assume that clarity is a reward, a sign of superiority, or a source of confidence. But true clarity is rarely comfortable. It requires honesty, humility, and the courage to confront the aspects of yourself that you may wish to ignore. To be clear is to recognize your limitations and to hold yourself accountable for growth, understanding, and ethical action. It is a responsibility because it demands that you live consciously rather than passively, that you refuse to allow ignorance to dictate behavior. Clarity extends beyond the self into the way we interact with others. Those who see clearly must navigate a world in which most people operate under assumptions, illusions, or incomplete understanding. The responsibility of clarity is to communicate effectively, to share insight without alienating, and to act in a manner that balances truth with compassion. It is not enough to recognize patterns or anticipate outcomes. One must also consider the timing, the context, and the emotional readiness of those around you. Speaking too bluntly can create conflict, while remaining silent can perpetuate harm. Clarity demands discernment, patience, and a steady hand, because insight has consequences that ripple through the lives of others. The societal dimension of clarity carries its own responsibilities. Seeing what is hidden, understanding systemic patterns, or recognizing collective errors, positions a person to act as a guide, observer, or agent of change. But this is not a privilege. It is a duty that requires courage, restraint, and moral awareness. To ignore injustice, corruption, or human suffering when one perceives it clearly is to abdicate responsibility. To act recklessly, without thought or compassion, is to misuse the power of insight. Clarity is therefore a form of stewardship. It is the understanding that knowledge alone is insufficient, and that the way it is applied shapes outcomes, affects relationships, and influences the world at large. Clarity also comes with the burden of solitude. Those who perceive more deeply often find themselves misunderstood, isolated, or even challenged by those who are not ready to recognize what has been seen. The responsibility of clarity is to maintain composure, to remain true to understanding even when external pressures demand conformity or denial. It is to endure the loneliness that comes with insight, the frustration of witnessing patterns of error that others cannot yet recognize, and the temptation to compromise truth for convenience. The clarity that isolates is not a privilege to be flaunted, it is a weight to be carried with integrity and patience. Moreover, clarity demands continuous vigilance. It is not static or permanent. Awareness must be nurtured, examined, and refined. To assume that once insight is gained, it can be used indiscriminately is to misunderstand its nature. The responsibility of clarity is ongoing. To question assumptions, to reflect on perceptions, and to adjust understanding in light of new evidence. This dynamic process requires humility, attentiveness, and discipline. Clarity is therefore not an entitlement or a mark of intelligence. It is a responsibility that demands effort, persistence, and ethical consideration. Emotional intelligence is a key aspect of clarity as responsibility. Seeing truth clearly often evokes intense feelings, anger at injustice, sadness at suffering, or frustration at ignorance. The responsible individual must manage these emotions, channeling them constructively rather than allowing them to dictate reaction. Clarity without emotional discipline can lead to rash decisions, alienation, or harm, demonstrating that insight alone is insufficient. Responsibility tempers vision, guiding it into action that aligns with ethical principles, compassion, and strategic awareness. It ensures that perception serves growth rather than destruction. Finally, clarity requires courage because it positions the individual at the intersection of awareness and choice. To see what is real is to recognize that choices carry consequences, that actions affect others, and that inaction can perpetuate harm. The privilege often imagined in clarity is replaced by the moral and practical responsibility to act with care, wisdom, and foresight. The clarity that illuminates must also guide, direct, and moderate, or it risks becoming a source of isolation, frustration, or unintended consequences. It is a responsibility that touches every aspect of life, internal, interpersonal, and societal, and demands consistent attention, ethical judgment, and steadfast courage.